Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us in this very important methane moment. I just wanted to start off thanking the panelists for joining us today. Fred Krupp is going to join us. He's in a press conference with the COP28 president. Here, just go here. So 2023 is on track to be the warmest year to date, and judging from the massive climate-related impacts we've experienced this year alone, we know that every tenth of a degree matters, and it matters most to the most vulnerable to climate change. And as we dangerously approach to overcoming the 1.5 degree goal, we must focus on measures that have to prevent warming in the short term. Cutting non-CO2 superpollutants such as methane, black carbon, nitrous oxide, HFCs, or tropospheric ozone can reduce warming faster than decarbonization alone, and are key emergency brake solutions to tackle the climate crisis. Doing so, we could prevent a lot of air pollution, and we could also save lives and protect the planet. During COP26, 2 years ago, US and the EU launched the Global Methane Pledge, with 106 countries joining the call to mitigate methane emissions, a leading superpollutant. The Global Methane Hub was established to help implementation with an initial philanthropic contribution of $210 million to be deployed between the years 2022 and 2025. Since then, the Global Methane Pledge has grown to 155 countries, and the two largest emitting countries, the US and China, have worked to establish methane mitigation action plans and have committed to include methane and non-CO2 pollutants in their NDCs. Today, we also heard that Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, the fourth and 15th biggest oil and gas producing countries in the world, have also joined the methane pledge. The EU has adopted import standards for the oil and gas sector, making the emission standards extensible to those who want to access the European oil and gas market. Only implementing these measures, we could reduce oil and gas emissions by a third and contribute to meeting a fifth of all the methane pledge target. Yet, while methane has contributed to nearly half the warming we've experienced to date, only 1% of climate-related philanthropic funding goes to methane, and only 2% of climate finance overall. So today, we're gathering with a group of panelists who want to change that, and we'll hear announcements on how to reduce emissions urgently, including the hardest nut to crack, livestock emissions. So I'm going to start off with a question for Christy. We had big news in the morning at 9 a.m., great thing to drink coffee to, big announcement. I just want to tell you, Philanthropy has helped support methane and HFC emission mitigation, helping the Methane Pledge and the Kigali Amendment. You have that great announcement today that led all the different participants in this panel contributing to it. Why is tackling superpollutants important, crucial to address the climate crisis? Christy.
Thanks, Marcelo. Thanks for the background and the introduction. So there's a couple things that we're certain of. One is that the speed of an equitable and just transition matters. Communities are already facing the impacts of climate change. Earlier today, I was at the Climate Vulnerable Forum. We heard from presidents and prime ministers there that they're grappling with more frequent and more extreme weather events, and the livelihoods and the health of their citizens are being affected, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. And two is that the climate science supports speed, and the lever for addressing speed is superpollutants. According to the IPCC's sixth assessment report, superpollutants contribute to over half of global climate change, and cutting these, of course, when paired with necessary decarbonization efforts, can help reduce near-term warming 4 times faster than focusing on decarbonization alone. On non-CO2 emissions. This makes the difference between a scenario which substantially overshoots 1.5 and risks triggering irreversible climate tipping points, and one which doesn't. So that's the reason that today, Climate Philanthropies, and yes, represented by the 4 of us and several others, announced $450 million in 2023 and over the next 3 years to catalyze a faster phase down of non-CO2 superpollutants. So as Marcelo said, this is essentially like pulling a climate emergency brake on warming. So those are the things that we're certain of. The things that we are not certain of. How quickly voluntary pledges of non-CO2 gases, which is great that they have been signed by countries and companies, we're not certain that they will become mandatory measures. And we're not certain that those mandatory measures will be implemented, and not certain how fast they will be implemented. So our commitment is going to increase the probability of success that the implementation of these measures not only happen, but they also support countries who are taking a step forward to address superpollutants. Marcelo has mentioned a couple ways that philanthropy has supported this topic in the past. In 2016, it has a good history. In 2016, before the Methane Hub announcement, philanthropists also supported the implementation of the Kigali Amendment to the Paris Agreement, and that was through putting together a Fast Start Fund of $50 million to support countries in realizing their ambition on phasing down HFCs. So like that commitment, the commitment announced today will support governments that have already announced plans to phase down superpollutants by kickstarting implementation. It will also help countries in expediting national actions and to catalyze ambitious economy-wide NDCs that incorporate all climate pollutants, which has been called by the COP28 presidency, called for by the COP28 presidency. And then lastly, to governments to leverage additional resources to triple climate finance on non-CO2 pollutants by the end of the decade. So I'll echo Marcelo saying every 10th of degree does matter. And that's why putting resources towards stopping the rate of warming is so important. It matters to everyone here at COP, it matters to vulnerable communities, and it also matters to future generations who don't have a voice at the table.
Thanks, Chrissy. That's great. So we're gonna talk to Kate now. Kate from the Children Investment Fund Foundation, which was also one of the founding members of the Global Methane Hub, and also contributed to the Clean Air Fund overall. You saw this opportunity to have a commitment within methane mitigation. And today we have a whole bunch of other different commitments on oil and gas sector reductions. We have the charter that's being announced at this very moment at the Methane Summit. So methane emissions can be detected from space through satellite observations. How can these measurements be leveraged to drive emission reductions, and how do you think it could contribute to change the energy markets?
Thanks a lot. Just putting it in a bit of context, because I don't know how many people are kind of methane geeks or satellite geeks in the audience, but for those who are just general COP watchers, to put this into context, we've got the pre-2030 period and we've got the post-2030 period, and the global stock take and the next round of NDCs is for the post-2030 period. So you heard Dr. Sultan today say, look, we've got all these commitments from oil companies. We can do more on methane. It's the low-hanging fruit. We want all countries to have economy-wide, all GHG NDCs for 2035. But actually what we want to do is get oil and gas out of the system for 2030. And in fact, many of the oil company pledges this time and OGCI around Paris are actually about the 2030 timeline. The tricky thing is there isn't a kind of an international ratchet process for the current NDCs. The only way that will be driven is through accountability and policy. So this mismatch between timelines and urgency that we're seeing at this COP is one of the really, really big challenges that we're facing, whether it's on renewables or whether it's on methane. So that will all get fought out in the process. So where does accountability and monitoring fit into that? Clearly, a key role for philanthropy is bringing together ecosystems that make things work. So we support initiatives like launching satellites, like supporting the NGO community to advocate for targets and so on. All of those things need to work together, but they need to drive towards regulation ultimately. But in the meantime, what we can do is have real-time point source data for the first time. There are satellites being launched this year, which are going to give us a really, really good way of identifying methane leakage. And it will also drive awareness of where the leakage is. So depending on the different satellites, some of them have quite high resolution, some of them have quite low resolution. So some of them can be really used for enforcement, some of them can really spot new sources of methane. But making all of that work together is going to be really, really important for people to understand the scale of the problem, because this has often been a sort of an underreported area. And that's not even thinking about other greenhouse gases. Methane is already much further along than other greenhouse gases. So we have good monitoring of air pollution in some cities around the world, but not even that good. Other greenhouse gases from agriculture and waste and other things are not well monitored. So this is the beginning of a move towards real-time accountability, because if you think about the UN emissions reporting process, by the time the emissions are out, it's already too late. So if we're trying to halve global emissions by 2030, by the time we get the emissions data, it's too late. What we need is real-time data that can reinforce decisions around finance, around policy, around public awareness, around reputation, that can also support investors and companies when they're taking decisions, and can also support countries. So if you take, for example, the newly announced EU regulation, which has an extraterritorial impact, it's saying any fossil fuels sold into the EU are going to have to comply with these new methane rules. We'll have visibility around the world on that level of compliance for those kinds of regulations. So it's potentially really exciting. So while we don't necessarily have the regulation everywhere that we need, what we do have is real visibility, real transparency that's starting to emerge. But it needs to be connected into an ecosystem of civil society, business, investor, and government awareness and action. There is a UN-led International Methane Emissions Observatory that's going to house a lot of this data. And again, having a bunch of civil society satellites and things funded by Philanthropy is all well and good, but actually it needs to plug into official processes for legitimacy. So that's really, really, really important. Global Methane Hub, which Marcelo runs very expertly and which we love to support. And then there's also initiatives like Climate and Clean Air Coalition. All of these places can benefit from this kind of information. And that's why GMH has launched the Data to Action campaign. So just to sum up, if you're thinking about how this is relevant, what Christy said is absolutely right. This is the only way to slow the rate of warming increase, and we've got to do that for the sake of frontline communities that should always be at the front of our mind. But this can also create an entirely new way of connecting new modern ways of monitoring pollution directly to accountability, investment decisions, compliance decisions, regulatory design. And we're going to start with methane and oil and gas because it's easiest, but it can be expanded to other gases and it can be expanded to other sectors. So this is the beginning of a move. There's going to be nowhere to hide. So companies are making pledges, but we're moving voluntary on the conveyor belt to regulatory, and we're going to do it with massive public accountability in the interim.
Thank you so much, Kate. So Andrew, the Bezos Earth Fund has really taken methane seriously. I think we started our jobs nearly the same time, and I've seen that shift that's very profound. You supported the development of MethaneSat also, like SIF, helped launch the IMEO methane alert response system, of which we heard yesterday's 127 largest super emitters overall to tackle oil and gas emissions. And now you've turned your focus over to the food system, one of your, how I met you, the food loss and waste and things like that, one of your personal causes from your life in climate action. Can you tell me about this work and why methane is so important to the Bezos Earth Fund?
Well, it's no accident that you and I started the same. It's because of you and the methane hub that is irresistible, quite frankly. Some of you won't have known Marcelo in the old days. He was Minister of Environment in Chile and a spectacular global player and incredible domestic policies, introducing all kinds of market-based approaches, protecting vast amounts of land and ocean, and just doing a bunch of crazy things that were right on the frontiers. And so we're really very pleased that you're running Methane Hub. And the fact that it's actually based in the Southern Hemisphere, in Chile, where incidentally you have a lot of cattle, actually not so much in Chile, but across the mountains, a lot there. So yes, we take it very seriously for all the reasons that Christy and Kate and Marcelo have mentioned. It's a massively exciting, well, not exciting, but it's a massively big problem with some exciting possibilities, actually. Now, the Bezos Earth Fund likes to go to dark and dangerous places, and so we go to the second biggest polluting species on the planet. The first most polluting is, of course, humans, where we spend most of our energy. But the second is cattle, of course. And oil and gas is a major emitter of methane. So too, sort of garbage. Marcelo, this is actually quite difficult. We actually know more about the dark side of the moon than we know about a cow's stomach, believe it or not, or stomachs. Andy, I think that's right. And so you ask the question, how do you actually reduce methane emission from cattle? Well, you've got to try lots of things, actually. So first thing we're putting money into is analyzing the stomach of a cattle, and you are leading the enteric methane accelerator, and it's very exciting. So we're putting $5 million into that, and that will really try to understand in much greater detail what actually happens down there that causes all this methane. Second thing you have to think about is what do they eat, and could that make a difference? And so we're looking at anti-methane compounds in feed and forage. We're working with Biodiversity International, so there's a great link here with Isma Zahan and the CGIAR system. And there the issue is, it turns out that actually, if cattle eat different kinds of things, sometimes they emit less methane. Well, we actually don't know anything about that. So that's why we're putting 15 million into that. Third, you have to think about, well, what about their DNA? I mean, suppose we could get, if there's a distribution of cows and this cow emits less than this cow, or maybe we could get this cow to breed with a cow that also doesn't emit very much. And that requires actually very serious work. And so we're doing a whole lot of DNA work on that, to identify, once you've got the genome of a cow, identify exactly which parts would make a difference. And then you could, if you live in America at least, you could genetically modify the cow. If you live in Europe, where you don't believe in that, you would simply get them to breed, and you'd use that old-fashioned approach. Then finally, we actually don't know very well how to measure methane from cows. You'll often see pictures of cows put in chambers, and they measure it. It's very expensive to do. So we're actually investing in a measuring, a cheap measuring instrument that goes in a cow's nose, actually, because as you know, most of the methane comes out the front rather than the back. And we're putting, I think, $5 million into that. Now, I hope you're with me, because, I mean, it couldn't be more exciting than that, could it? But it actually illustrates, and by the way, Andy Jarvis, Dr. Andy Jarvis over here, who comes to us from the CGIAR system and still sits in SEAT in Cali, Colombia. He's leading all of our work here. But it actually illustrates an important point, that actually making announcements at events like this, you can is potentially even more value-adding than the obvious things that we all spend a lot of money on, which is investing in renewable energy and so on. The impact can be absolutely huge.
Thanks. Yes, it's been great working with Basil Earthon from the beginning, and also the support for the methane alert response system. And your cow science. I think Andy has been good conversations, and I also learned a lot from Hayden Montgomery. This is actually the biggest livestock research effort ever to tackle methane emissions, and we're very happy this is happening now, because we can't reach 1.5 without lowering livestock emissions too. So Jess, from Quadrature Climate Foundation, your foundation has always been focusing on forward-looking solutions based on science, things like methane oxidation or enteric fermentation. So science and technology is at the core. You yourself were IPCC, worked in the IPCC process. Why is QCF looking for these breakthroughs?
We're looking for these breakthroughs, I think, for the same reason as others on the panel. I think most of us work with, what's the size of the problem and what's the gap in the solution. And when you map those two things on, methane screams out, but enteric methane in particular for us really screams out as an area that, 30% of all methane emissions and nowhere near the kinds of solutions that you find in the oil and gas space. So that's why we are looking at it. I suppose we're taking two very specific approaches. One is, like Bezos, we are going into the methane enteric accelerator. There are other solutions, of course, for enteric methane. One of them that we haven't talked about today is herd size reduction. Now, that is something that has to be done. It is difficult and it is slow, and you have to treat it incredibly sensitively. And it's going to take time. And I think it's important that we continue to hold that as a potential solution. And while that takes time, we need the innovation on enteric methane, all of the solutions that Andrew has proposed. And those solutions exist, and they're getting off the ground, and that's really exciting. The next hurdle is that every cow is different. Every herd is different. There's differences between and within farms. There's differences across geographies, and all of these solutions are very, very, very specific. So the next big challenge that the enteric accelerator has is to look at how you can scale some of these solutions to the size of impact that we really need. And so, like Bezos and like others, we are absolutely thrilled and relieved that the enteric methane accelerator exists, so that we don't have to do this work ourselves, and we've got some of the best brains working on it. On removals, we are also thinking about methane removals. And again, the size of the problem there is worrying. It's not just anthropogenic removals that we're looking at here. So it's not simply a case of, removals potentially displacing reductions. We know that we need to continue to put pressure on the reduction of methane gases. But as the climate warms, natural methane is going to become a real problem, an expanding problem. So we may need some quite serious removal technologies further down the line. When we think about methane removal, it's not really the same as CO2 removal. It's an oxidative pathway, so you don't really get rid of the problem. You kind of break it down into water and CO2, but it's better than methane, and it's a solution that we may need. So at QCF, we are thinking about how to answer a question that is going to be a really, really long road to answer. It's probably going to take about 10 years before we get the kinds of technological solutions that we might need, and we'll be thinking about 10 years we might need them. So we're starting to think about it now. But we are not entirely naive about this. So we're looking at questions right now of risk and questions of viability before we go forward with actual investment in that research. I think the key thing for us is that there is no silver bullet for methane, like there isn't for anything else. And I think the variety of solutions that we've talked about on this panel just show that we're going to need a real portfolio approach here. And that's, again, why it is delightful to be partnering with other funders and you, Marcelo, to kind of bring us all together.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and it's true that many of these solutions that you are trying to find are actually mitigation in many ways. For example, an abandoned coal mine, you need these passive technologies to be there. And when you're in a wetland, it could work for a wetland, or it could work for a rice plantation, which is also a type of wetland, or a landfill that's also spewing a lot of methane. Yeah. We need to find ways to oxidize that methane too. Yeah. So I wouldn't say, as you say, it's not a removal, nothing to do with carbon removal. It's actually mitigation in many ways. So Ismahani, I wanted to ask you, mitigating methane in the livestock sector is challenging, and these farmers aren't having a good time, facing drought, increasing cost of labor, and multiple other things. And it's uniquely challenging, critical to countries and regions in which the CGIAR works. Could you tell us a little bit about CG's activities to address methane from the agricultural sector, and how you balance this with sustainable rural development and nutritional security?
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and a pleasure to be with so many foundations that eventually I can convince to come and support us as CGR. But I think many of the colleagues might not know what CGR is, so if I could just take 30 seconds to introduce the CGR. So the CGR is the largest publicly funded international agricultural research that started back in the 70s. They are behind the Green Revolution as we know it, that have saved more than 1 billion people. And it is a group of international agricultural research that are based mostly in the South. And because we deal with agriculture and we work a lot with national program, we work a lot with farmers, we see really the reality of climate change on the ground. We see how farmers are really grappling with huge issues. The variability, it's tremendous and it's huge. And we all know that really we need to stop. We need to change our agri-food system and we need to change our practices. So if we look at the methane, for example, so other than the carbon per se, the greenhouse gas, we know that the agriculture is producing about 25% or 1/3, 30%. But for the methane, we know that beef and dairy cows produce about 30% of human-caused methane emissions and rice 10%. So if you look at this, it shows you where the solution is. So we need really to look at science and innovation as all the panelists have already addressed. So there are, for the rice component, for example, the rice is a crop that we can produce more in the future. It's not going down. Africa has a plan to increase its productivity in rice, for example. So it's very important to find solutions that really reduce methane from rice agri-food system. And we have alternate wet, dry rice cultivation that can cut 30 to 70% of the rice sector greenhouse gas emissions, both. We have new rice varieties that can be directly seeded that requires about third of less water, that also reduce 90% of the methane. So most of the methane is happening really in the wet times. And those solutions needs to be upscaled. We need to continue the research to bring new variety using gene editing and other modern technologies, but we need also to scaling them up at the small scale producers. On the livestock, it's a much more complex, let's see, polluter and methane issue. And I think really Matthew addressed it very well and shows the different components. So there, one of the areas that we are working with the Bezos Foundation and other colleagues is to look at the forages, to look at the species of forages and look in our gene banks. And we have some of the largest gene banks that covers many species, but particularly for forages. And there, what we are looking for is to look to new species. And we have one species that we are looking at, particularly called Coronivia grass, that reduces not only methane, but reduces also N2O. So we are very excited and we are very grateful to the Bezos Foundation, but also to Methane Hub and to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because they are financing an area that we couldn't find other foundation to finance it earlier. So it's really a novel research area that we know that we can tackle through the forages, through the genetic on the breeding of the livestock per se, as you said earlier, and through also maybe one area that it is novel and we don't have much, it's really the microbiome of the guts of the cows per se. So thank you very much for your support and looking forward to do more. I think because we have pushed for so much livestock for the last century, it is not realistic, particularly from the perspective of nutrition and sustainability that you mentioned, Marcello, to completely cut it. The only way to do it is to improve it. So if we want to improve it, the genetic component is huge. And we know today on the genetics of animals and interaction between bacteria and forages much more than just 20 years ago. But there are other areas that I think we have to do. It's look at it as an agri-food system. There are a lot of practices that can reduce methane as well. And we need to do both the frontier science to get the best cattle that produce more in terms of nutrition and quantity, but less in terms of methane. But we have to combine it with different practices that allows also the farmers to have more income, to reduce their pollution, and to continue their life and livelihoods. And maybe to close, the CGR has been really blessed in this COP28 to get pledges from different donors. So the portfolio is large. And we are looking forward really in the next 10 years to find a proper science and evidence-based to monitor methane, monitor carbon, methane nitroxide, but also to provide to those small-scale producer solutions on the ground. And there we have a large investment case of $4 billion. We have announced today with many donors about 900 millions, but we are looking forward to really have people to support us. For the methane is very important, and we are very grateful, but I see other foundations that we haven't worked with that I think really it will be very important to engage with you. And also tackling the other components that are maybe not methane, but they are indirectly affecting the methane pollution. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ismani. It's great to hear also these measures that not only bring mitigation benefits, income benefits, but also adaptation benefits, which is an entry point that you could really have with Ministry of Agriculture. With Andrew, we worked in the Global Center for Adaptation, Global Commission Adaptation, and it's great to see both worlds combined because that's one that nobody will push back against. And of course, just giving background of the Enteric Accelerator itself, it's over $200 million that have been of grant money that's from philanthropy mostly, but also a big contribution from governments that have unique methane mitigation challenges. The USDA, the government of New Zealand, Ireland, Canada are all tackling this and considering this as a really big challenge, but also the corporate sector. Yesterday we had a meeting with the CEO of Danone telling us about the different challenges, and they are the first corporate donor to this, and they see this also as an implementation to reduce the cost of implementation of their own 30% mitigation target as a corporation. So Fred just joined us and probably has a whole bunch of new things to share because we all missed the summit and the developments on the energy sector. Fred, EDF has been one of the pioneers in the NGO space on methane, long before the
methane, oil and gas methane for sure. And I'll get to that, but I'm not going to really describe it in detail because that would be off topic. But let me say this, we have been at the Environmental Defense Fund, we have long prioritized methane emissions as super important because few people know, you may all know, but few do, that the methane emissions this year from human-caused activities will warm the planet as much over the next decade as all the CO2 from burning all the fossil fuel on the planet. Now, that is not a reason to slow down. In fact, we have to speed up driving CO2 down, but it is an opportunity to get pretty big reductions in the temperatures against what we would otherwise see from business as usual by investing in methane. We have to do both. We have to be able to multitask. When the global methane pledge, one of the ways that it changed when EDF started working on methane, people would ask us, methane's also a greenhouse gas? I mean, it was really unknown 12 years ago. And I think the global methane pledge a couple of years ago was a big turning point because it really brought methane to center stage at the COP, to center stage in the climate conversation. And, that was, one of the big changes. And another big change that I see happening right now that this panel is part of is the idea that, hey, you know what? Food and agriculture are a big source. In fact, agriculture is a little bit bigger of a source of methane than all fossil fuel emissions. Now, fossil fuel has a much easier time. There's no excuse. It should have been done 10, 20 years ago. Agriculture is harder, but there's no excuse for not starting now. And I would say in terms of agriculture, we have to remember that the farmers are on the front lines. They are being impacted by this chaotic weather, by these extremes. And yes, they are also a source of a lot of methane, but they're also dealing with the fact that they're losing production because of global warming in many parts of the world. So there's a food security issue here as well. So I was heartened when I say another turning point is happening maybe this week. I would say not only this panel, but also yesterday, 130 countries signed on to the UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems, and Climate Action, which is really, welcome progress. So methane from agriculture is about 40% of the anthropogenic total. It's enormous, and livestock farming is the vast majority of that. So the dairy sector just by itself is about 10% of global methane emissions. And we can there's things we can do about methane right now, depending on the country you're in. Better nutrition, better health for the animals. R2 manure management in some places is a third. So, but we have to remember that all of this has to be done with a perspective that it's been estimated about 1 billion people on the planet get their livelihood from dairy. And we have to be concerned about that as well. So not the only solution, but one solution is to go for a triple win, which is to, yes, reduce methane emissions, stabilize the climate, boost farmer livelihoods, a second win, and 3, support nutrition by creating more protein. Because when the animal is fed a better mix of grain, even the same grain, but in different proportions on different days, in different ratios, when it's producing more milk, it's producing less methane. It produces methane when it's not producing milk. So these are all things we can do. And I would say everything needs to be local and regional. There's different solutions in different places. And one of the things we have been doing is, as you mentioned, Marcelo, is beginning to work with companies. So earlier this year, I think one of the turning points we've seen is Danone agreed with EDF, and we announced it in a joint op-ed that Antoine and I, the CEO, and I wrote. They became the first major company outside of fossil fuels to take a specific target on methane. 30% reduction, and not by some crazy 2050 date. Not that I'd say 2050 is not important, but actually it is not very important compared to what's going to happen this year and next year. 2030 is so much more important. They agreed to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, and they've already started. They're on their journey, and we're proud to be partnering with, and that's not the only, as you just mentioned, Marcelo, they're also the first company to join the Enteric Accelerator, which is vital for the emissions that we need to reduce in the next decade. The research that needs to be done now is going to give us results in the next decade after we've done the short-term thing. So, one thing I just want to say is Danone has been a great partner, not only because of what they've committed to do in their own operation, but they are leaning in with us, jointly visiting other dairy companies, recruiting them to be part of similar efforts. And we're going to announce a similar effort. I can't announce it here, but December 5th at 3:30 in the Women's Pavilion Majlis in the Green Zone, we will announce something. So that is what we call a teaser, and you are all invited. Lisbeth, you look definitely teased. I saw that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So it's been a great day for methane. I just wanted to ask the panelists if they could give just a short final remark of what this day means on methane mitigation, on super pollutant mitigation, and what you hope for COP. Christy?
Sure. I mean, I think from my point of view, yes, methane is important, and I appreciate. I think one of the things that was important to us at Sequoia was to broaden it to the non-CO2 greenhouse gas and climate pollutants frame. Methane is important, and so are the other set of F gases and nitrous oxide, and black carbon and ground level ozone. So raising the profile of those alongside a methane was critical to us. At COP, I've really appreciated the call for all greenhouse gas NDCs coming up, and looking forward to working with the set of stakeholders on raising the ambition, thinking about how to set those targets, and thinking about the more important part of that, which would be implementing those.
Andrew?
Well, a great day for methane. Thank you for those that worked so hard on it. Thank you, Fred, for much earlier than most sort of lightening the path for us on this. And a great start to the COP. I mean, much better than people expected, and very encouraging for the next week. We need, back to the methane issue on cattle, our program is called Cow 2.0, and that's sort of what we need, a new way of doing it. But there's an even more important point. It's not, we're not going to solve the problem just by changing the technology or even changing the cow. We will solve the problem when we change our behavior. And the best way, if you want to stop methane from cattle, is not to eat it, and not to drink its milk. And so an additional part of what we're doing, investing sort of quite heavily, we're just about to, in alternative proteins, and in particular in lab-grown. And the amazing thing is you can now eat beef without killing a cow by taking the DNA and then basically in a lab creating it. Andy and I went down last week to to North Carolina, where they have amazing technology doing this. So that would enable us to have enjoyable lifestyles, but just stop eating what currently is causing a sort of massive problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can reduce herd size. We can actually, Global North probably should reduce meat intake. Global South probably needs to increase. FAO put out 2 reports that sounded incompatible. They certainly are compatible, that some need to reduce meat intake, some do need more meat for nutritional value that does not exist. And we could do it with less cows because, basically with the productivity improvements, 5-fold, one animal in Europe creates the same milk as 5 animals in North Africa. So we could do it also. Jess?
Thanks. So look, I think the announcements made today are fantastic, and I want to thank fellow panelists for the work that you put into those in particular. So very exciting for us, and I also think it's quite important that we put methane in context, which we sometimes forget to do. So action on methane buys us time, but it doesn't displace the need to work on CO2 over the long term, and I think it's important that we continue to repeat that message.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. Kate?
We just need to get every single greenhouse gas in country on a conveyor belt of collaborate, pledge, measure, regulate, and implement, and learn all the way through. And we're at different stages for all of these different gases, and there are different ways in. So sometimes it's via cities, and sometimes it's via satellites, and sometimes it's via, different kinds of pledges on stages. But we have to get moving faster. It took about 5 years of intense lobbying to get the Kigali Agreement to the Montreal Protocol. Still not fully implemented. There are still countries here who are saying, we're going to sign up to that. It's a slow process. We need to accelerate all of that, and we need to implement.
Thanks, Kate. Ismahani?
So I think really we need more science and innovation. We need to use big data to understand what's happening. So it is important that we tackle every gas alone, but we have to look at all of them. And I agree with Andrew that we need to look at complementary proteins. So we need to look at other sources of proteins. And there, I want to just maybe a shout out for diversification. When we need to diversify our system, If I give you just quickly the examples of plant, I don't have the numbers in animals, but in plant we have 400,000 species, and we are using only 125 of them right now in the market. The numbers in animals is different, but still there is too much focus on certain species, and by diversifying, we will find solutions, because most probably we are going into species that haven't been bred only for productivity without looking at other environmental, let's see, problem. Algae, for example, as feed, it's tremendous, be it for nutrition, be it also for methane, and there is more to be discovered. So we need to really push more for science in this decade to find the right solutions.
Great. And Fred.
Thanks, Marcelo. I would just say, in addition to joining us on December 5th for the new announcement, that we've got to figure out how to help the farmers with the money that's going to be needed to invest. So there's a lot of money that I said is great that's been put into the Enteric Accelerator, which will help us in the next decade. But what can we get done by 2030? As Hayden and I have talking about, that's kind of my obsession. And we can get a lot of methane down in 2030, but only if we figure out ways to finance farmers to make the changes that needs to be done. And that's going to require private capital, it's going to require philanthropic capital, it's going to require especially government capital. Governments like to subsidize farmers. Let's have them subsidize something that actually can help farmers and use protein and more nutrition. We have a world where we have too many people starving. So, to me, that triple is where we should focus, and we should absolutely focus on not so much on 2050, but on the 2030s for sure, and definitely on the rest of this decade, because if Danone can get 30%, I bet, and they have 58,000 farms supplying them. I'm sure there's a lot of other dairy companies that could, with a will, join them, and we need to encourage them to do just that.
Great, thank you. So what I like to say always about mitigating methane and other short-lived climate pollutants is the benefits stay where action is taken, and this is really a changing idea, because developing countries always ask, why should I do it if China and the US aren't doing it? First off, they are, right? There's a commitment, there's an NDC, there's the biggest funding package ever. We have twice the climate finance this year versus last year. Things are changing. But why would a farmer not want to increase productivity and have better resilience? Why wouldn't a landfill operator or mayor want to plug that landfill leak that's causing fires and bad odors? Why wouldn't oil and gas sector or the community want to receive lower exposure to benzene? Or why wouldn't we want to kick out the smoker in our house because of the natural gas stove that's actually causing more pollution than having somebody smoke? So that's, I think, the key thing, the message that we need to provide, that this is not about the moral imperative. It's a global public good. It's the local benefit. And that's what you're going to get people really to buy in. So thank you for attending today's session. And I'll see you December 5th.